Hey everyone, this is Jack coming back to you from my living room. I'm joined today by my co-host Jess. In this episode of The Invisible Revealed, we will be discussing how misunderstood the pressure of schoolwork as well as personal lives is for students. The pressure put on students to do well in the increasingly difficult courses as well as managed life outside of school that may be more difficult than anyone ever realized. This can create stress and anxiety.
There have been many studies done on the toll of being a student throughout the years. There have been considerable negative emotions that stem from being a student, as well as negative consequences towards a student's academic performance.
In the past year, 85.6% of students felt overwhelmed. There's a huge amount of pressure put on students to get good grades, excel in extracurricular activities, maintain a social life, stay organized, and in general just be on top of everything. On top of that, imagine having to deal with personal problems that can affect you at school, whether that be worry of having enough money, achieving your parents' expectations, or dealing with a medical issue. Stress will manifest itself even more if you are dealing with a personal problem in school. When a student is stressed, it preoccupies them. It takes over a portion of the brain. This makes it harder to focus during lectures or studying. One report states that 25% of students affected by stress noticed a considerable drop in their grades, and some even considered dropping out. Proper support is needed to fully take care of someone undergoing some issues that are affecting them emotionally. Unfortunately, most of the time students will conceal all these problems from others. Students who are struggling with their emotions find other ways of coping which might not always be a healthy practice. An issue in our educational system is that help and support isn't always given to those who are concealing their issues. According to the American Psychological Association, a strong relationship between students and teachers is vital to increasing a student's academic and social achievements. Getting over stress and personal dilemmas is hard and can sometimes take years, but with the proper support and effort, these problems can be overcome.
That's right, Jack. These things take time. I know this from personal experience. In 8th grade, I got concussed during a soccer event at school. From this concussion, I had to miss 3 months of school because I was not able to handle the amount of work or activity that happened at school. Afterwards, I went 4 months of school, only going to classes in the morning, and then afterwards going home. For the remainder of the school year, I only attended math, science, and French, which were my main courses at school. So for that entire year, I only really got grades for those 3 classes. After that year, I started to feel a lot better after the incident, and I was able to recuperate most of what I was previously unable to do. The next year, I had received a relapse after an incident in one of my drama classes that was very, very noisy. This incident led to this discovery of post-concussion syndrome, which is like having a concussion, except there is no actual brain damage. It is only all the symptoms of having a concussion. After realizing that I had this, I went to CHIO for many, many tests and scans to make sure that it was truly what it was. Afterwards, I did a lot of physiotherapy to recover a lot of the muscles in my neck that I had damaged due to whiplash. These physiotherapy sessions made me miss half of my afternoon classes every week. While in CHIO, I was encouraged to join a yoga program that was run by the hospital. This yoga program run by CHIO was a group of students or youth who were concussed or had previously gone through a concussion and needed help dealing with emotions or activity. And it was a center where all the youth could come together and discuss anything that they were dealing with at the time. After joining this CHIO group for youth who had concussions, I also joined an experimental research group, which consisted of a group of 10 to 12 doctors who were solely focused on your case. These doctors ranged from therapists to chiropractors to medical doctors. After joining this experimental research group for concussions among youth, I spent the next year on a multitude of different medications and regime to help me learn to live with what I considered to be my new normal. Constantly having headaches or neck pain or any other symptoms that I would have to deal with. I spent quite a bit of time in CHIO for all of these different activities and groups that I was a part of. And I also went to CHIO for an MRI to check for any residual damage that may be left on my brain from the concussion. While doing this MRI, doctors actually found a mass in my brain, and they weren't really sure what it was. So I went back a month later to do another MRI. And this time, they wanted to make sure that the mass hadn't grown any, because if it had grown, then they would have concluded that it was indeed cancerous. After being told about this mass that they were not sure about and that could possibly be cancerous, I spent months wondering what the results were because I was never informed of the final results when they came in. Obviously, my mind went to the worst case scenario of having cancer and that my life would be irreversibly changed. There was even a possibility of me dying because cancer is a very serious disease. Throughout this whole process, I did not mention any of this to any of my friends or anyone else in my life because I thought by ignoring it, I wouldn't have to deal with it or any of the consequences that came with it.
So, with such a scary event going on, how much stress did this put on you, and how did you deal with all that stress?
There was definitely a lot of stress that was put on me having to deal with all of this. I actually developed serious anxiety, which I was later diagnosed with. And ways that I found that helped me personally deal with all of this stress was to find ways of distracting myself. I would find things in school or other activities that I could focus on instead of all of the problems that were happening in my life. I also found ways of deflecting questions or concerns of others so that I wouldn't have to face what was really happening.
So, we now know that stress was a huge factor in this, but can you talk more about how anxiety and depression manifested itself during these 4 years?
Over the 4 years that this took place, it was a very slow and gradual process. I only realize now what I was going through, but at the time, I didn't notice my behavior changing at all. It only started with slight anxiety and then built to severe anxiety, and then later turned to depression when I found I was stuck inside a box and I couldn't get out.
So, how did this affect you socially?
As a high school student, obviously other students are curious about why maybe one student is receiving more attention than any other. So I would have many, many comments from other students about my disability. And some of those would be very negative, such as, you don't really have a disability, you are only faking it because it's not quite visible. So those comments led me to keeping it a secret, trying to move on with life like everyone else and do as much of normal activity as I possibly could so that I wouldn't have those negative feelings from everyone else.
Do you have any advice for people going through unbearable amounts of stress while coping with school?
From personal experience, I know that finding a focus is helpful. So Finding something that you can put your energy and time and concentration into so that you no longer have to constantly be thinking about all of those negative things happening in your life. I also found it helpful to discuss my feelings with a therapist or someone else in my life to help me understand better how to cope with situations that I was having a very difficult time dealing with.
Is there a main message or lesson you can take away from all of this now?
There is definitely a very big lesson that I learned from this in my life. I learned that you shouldn't stress on every small little thing that goes wrong in your life because they don't really matter in the big picture. What is truly important in your life is your health and your happiness over everything else, and that should be your main focus. So, Jack, what is your experience with your personal life having an effect on school?
So in grade 9, I started to play the bassoon, and I wanted to conform to my parents' expectations to do really well in school. So when my mom was in school, she excelled really far into playing the piano. And like her, I also wanted to show that I can also do as well or better on the bassoon. And I could tell, like, at home that she also expected me to do so. And I was prepared to do so. So I joined the Conservatory of Music in Gatineau, and I remained there in grade 10 and 11. I loved it for the first few years. And then once CEGEP started, it started to get to me. I started to get 7 hours a week of music, which doesn't sound like much, but it really impacted me to have to do that on top of all my schoolwork and then have all this theory homework to do as well. So it started to take a toll on me. So all this work to do with the conservatory and having to deal with school as well started to take a toll on me. So in December of last year, I decided to quit the conservatory. Quitting the conservatory gave me a lot more free time. I could be more flexible with the organization of my studies, and I no longer need to follow a set bassoon curriculum. I can play whatever I want, whenever I want. And overall, quitting, I think, really reduced stress for me. I in no means quit the bassoon, but I quit what was giving me all that stress.
Students go through a variety of different issues outside of their academic career. These issues spill over into their education and make it difficult to keep up with standards. Society doesn't understand the pressure put on students to do well in the increasing difficult courses, as well as manage a life outside of school that may be more difficult than anyone ever realized.
Managing stress can be done. As a first step, one should try and figure out, if it isn't obvious, what are the current stressors in life and how it is impacting them. Like Jess previously said, if distracting yourself works and you notice improvements in your happiness, then that is a possible solution. There are also other ways to help. It seems a little obvious, but it still needs to be said. Getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep each night is ideal, while going to bed at a reasonable hour is equally just as important. Staying healthy is helpful as well, so eating well, exercising, and relaxing are important. Talking to someone can also be helpful. Try talking to a parent or a relative. If those aren't good options for you, then you should also have access to a guidance counselor at school. There are also many hotlines available if any of these other resources aren't an option.
The lives of students are not only affected by the many challenges that getting an education brings, but also a multitude of problems that stem from just living their normal lives. It might not be blatantly obvious of how difficult things can be to the outside world, but as a student, you understand just how hard life can be.